Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick. And before we get started, as always, we invite you to hit those like and subscribe buttons and leave a comment below. We also welcome you to visit our t-shirt store so you can watch your favorite history movies in style, and also to visit our website that has all sorts of wonderful educational resources. For this episode, we will be analyzing Clint Eastwood's 2006 war drama entitled Flags of Our Fathers. This is about the small group of men who raised the flag atop Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945. I have particular affection for this film because of some family connections that I have with this movie. We're going to be unpacking that and much, much more in this episode. Let's not wait any further. Let's go ahead and revisit Clint Eastwood's Flags of Our Fathers. This opening vignette of a bewildered John Doc Bradley, as he was known, crying, I think is a very evocative way to open the film. It's a haunting scene and it sets the foundation for this emotional roller coaster that follows. And all throughout, after all, the movie is about people trying to come to terms with trauma.
Now, there are plenty of other photos taken that day, but none anybody wanted to see. What we see and do in war, the cruelty, is unbelievable.
One of the bits of critical displeasure with this film, I think, had to do with its dual narratives, if you will. In one regard, it's a war movie. In another regard, it's a home front movie. And it's also a movie about the veteran experience as well. I, for one, have never minded this formula. I think each of these three elements serve an important purpose. And I therefore encourage you, the audience, the viewers, to have an open mind about how this movie is structured. You have to pay attention, but I think it pays off in the long run. It might seem cinematically clunky at first, but it's historically very multifaceted, and I think it tells quite a story.
And if you can get a picture, now, the right picture, can win or lose a war.
You're gonna want to see this.
There's a lot to be said about Joe Rosenthal's photo, the flag raising. There's a sense of forward momentum to it. And one of the other things to think about, too, is that all of the faceless Marines in it attest to this idea of the conflict being an every man's war. You don't know who it is. It could be anybody in that photograph. I think that was part of the allure to it. And sure enough, the subsequent war bond motto associated with this iconic image was, "All together now."
Do anything on that reservation but play cards, Chief?
All right, listen up, you sorry bunch of leathernecks. We practice going over the side more, which means we ain't long for this piece of rock.
Sergeant Mike Strank was born in present-day Slovakia, but grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, not too far away from me, in fact. And actually, for the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima, representatives from his original hometown came to Johnstown for some of the commemorative activities. And so that was something that was very cool for me to see firsthand. But men looked up to Strank, and for good reason. His men in the 5th Marines were comprised of veteran combatants like himself, and also a lot of up-and-coming fresh replacements, including Marines from other divisions. Strank himself had fought with the 3rd Raiders on Bougainville and a variety of other engagements as well. And even though Barry Pepper is about a decade too old to be playing Strank, he still has that sort of fatherly bearing that works very well.
Our target, Island X, is an ugly, smelly, dirty little scab of rock called Iwo Jima. Means Sulphur Island, which accounts for the smell. Looks sort of like a burnt pork chop, you ask me.
This language matches that of how the Marines described the island in 1945, and sure enough, the pork chop was exceedingly well cooked after months and months of aerial bombardment. But Iwo Jima is about 750 miles away from the Japanese mainland, and as is the case with almost every battle fought in the Pacific, a land battle, that is, it is determined by the presence of an airfield.
12,000 Japanese defenders in 8 square miles. They will not leave politely, gentlemen. Now, the 28th will land here at Green Beach. The 8th Ammo Company will land here to resupply.
Segregation is something very important to think about here. It was very real in the Navy because black sailors were typically confined to the duties of cooks and stewards. And in the Marines, meanwhile, leadership in the Corps actively fought to keep black men out of fighting units well into 1942 and 1943. Interestingly enough, though, such characters are kind of segregated in this film too. They don't have much of a presence in this movie, so much so that director Spike Lee got into a verbal scuffle with Clint Eastwood on this topic. And in the long run, the lack of black characters in this movie prompted Spike Lee to make his own World War II film entitled Miracle at St. Anna, which unfortunately is not anywhere near as good as this movie is.
Look, I've had to make a few other changes. I'm promoting you to platoon sergeant. How are your men?
They'll do fine. Except maybe Gagnon.
Our own Tyrone Power?
As the film suggests, Rennie Gagnon joined the Marines in part because he thought their uniforms the sharpest. And the part here where Captain Severance calls him our very own Tyrone Power is really right on the money, because he looks a lot like the classic movie star of the 1930s and the 1940s. I mean, just look at that comparison. I think the resemblance is quite uncanny.
Think of your girls back home waiting for you. But a girl cannot stay home every night. And will he comfort her at your funeral? This is all, Fernand. I'll see you tomorrow night.
So why did American servicemen subject themselves to the propaganda of so-called Tokyo Rose? Simply put, it was the music. Both German and Japanese broadcasters played the biggest hits of the era, and between every song they would try to coax the Yanks into varying degrees of discomfort. Arnhem Annie and Axis Sally were European equivalents to this, and by and large, Americans would tune out the narration and just selectively listen to the music to pass the time. As I watch these scenes of landing craft approaching shore, I can't help but think of my own grandfather's Iwo Jima story. He was a signalman on the USS Lowndes, and he was actually assigned to a beach party that was going to take Marines ashore. But luckily, in the long term, he came down with appendicitis a mere 10 days before D-Day, and instead of participating in the battle, he watched it from the deck of his transport vessel. And 2 of his good buddies in the shore party actually died in the process. And so him getting appendicitis right before the invasion has made me ponder my very existence in the decades since. Seeing all this naval action on the deck reminds me of a few artifacts that I have here that belonged to my grandfather, including his Navy K-bar, and his initials, DF for David Frederick, are on it. So he carried this throughout the Pacific War, and I also have one of his Dixie cups as well, and given all the wear and tear on it, I fully suspect that this very well could have been the one that he was wearing on Iwo Jima. So these are some precious family artifacts that I have in my collection. These shots of the Japanese silently taking aim are very well done in my view because it's effective both cinematically and historically. There's a level of mystery and terror in their anonymity, and that sort of ghostly presence was truly matched by the historical reality of the moment. And as is depicted in the Flags of Our Fathers companion film, Letters from Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kurabayashi allowed for 4 or 5 waves of Marines to fill the beach to saturate the target area for his men. And on top of that, dozens upon dozens of tunnel systems spanned below the island, including 7 stories of these sort of fortifications on Mount Suribachi alone. The Japanese had excellent interior lines, and consequently, for Marines, the front line was in every direction. There was no such thing as behind the lines or a safe spot. The front line was anywhere you pointed your rifle. And when I visited Iwo Jima myself, it made me feel like I was walking atop one vast tomb. It was very, very surreal. But on that note, I'd like you all to check out the virtual tour that we have available from my trip to Iwo Jima. To my knowledge, it's the most in-depth tour of Iwo Jima that is available on the internet. So be sure you check that out. Click the link in the caption below.
There's already enough people shooting! One bullet and this thing goes up like a Roman candle! Go! Shoot fire!
The personality of flamethrower operator Chuck Lindberg is actually the only character to be credited in both Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. And I'm daily reminded of this real man because I, in fact, have this photograph hanging by my front door. And so every time I leave my house, I am reminded of Chuck Lindberg, who also was one of the flag raisers for the first flag that was hoisted atop Mount Suribachi. He signed this, and you can see him right there. Another fun artifact from my collection.
Oh, imagine, the governor is coming here to meet us. Now, I'm wearing blue, so are you going to change?
CBS World News has just announced that President Roosevelt is dead. The president died of a cerebral hemorrhage. All we know so far is that the president died at Warm Springs in Georgia.
For so many Americans, word of FDR's death on April 12, 1945 was just as shocking as news of the Pearl Harbor attack. And you have to think of it this way. Most GIs had been around 10 or 12 years old when Franklin Roosevelt was first elected in 1932. He was the only president that many of them could remember. And so his death, on the verge of victory no less, came as such an emotional shock to so many. And I'm even reminded of future Republican Senator Bob Dole, who was presumably ideologically different than Roosevelt. Dole was in Italy at the time, and when he heard word of Roosevelt's passing, he recalled that he fell down into his foxhole and just started weeping.
Dylan? Mr. President, here they are.
Well, hello. Good to see you, Mr. President. Darn good to see you, boys. Ira, you're off the Gila River Reservation in Arizona, am I right?
Yes, Mr. President.
Being an Indian, you are a truer American than any of us. Bet your people are proud to see you wear that uniform.
Very proud, sir.
So Hayes, Gagnon, and Bradley met with Truman at the White House just 9 days after FDR's death, so the nation was still very much in mourning at the time. And Bradley was actually still on crutches at that moment due to his Iwo wounding. And when you see the historical photographs that scroll through the end credits at the end of this movie, you can actually see a scene as such. But of all of these men, Ira Hayes, in my view, was definitely the most mysterious, partly because of his stoical yet emotional attitude and the fact that he lived in this sort of social borderland between segregation and acceptance. Because on one hand, he was not segregated from the military, but he was segregated in certain establishments back on the home front. And when considering that, combined with his post-traumatic stress, it's little wonder that he was bound for many of the psychological troubles ahead.
6 guys raising a flag over Iwo Jima. Victory is ours. You're 3 of them, right?
This was the 5th day, sir. The battle went on for 35 more.
Hey, you know what? I don't give a shit. You're in the picture, you raised the flag. That's the story we're selling, boys.
Are you deaf? Hank isn't in the picture. Harlan is in the picture.
There was confusion from the outset when people tried to identify the men in the photo. And there was another lingering question, too. Was the photo staged? And unfortunately, photographer Joe Rosenthal himself added fuel to the fire of speculation when referencing a different group photo from Iwo Jima. He said that that one had been staged, and people were all confused about which photograph he was talking about, and a comedy of errors ensued. But we'll get to the truth of the matter here in a bit. But for the purposes of the war bond drive and the conversation that we see in this scene, these 3 survivors were encouraged to sweep the reality under the rug in the name of good public relations.
You know what they're calling this bond drive? The Mighty Seventh. They might have called it that we're flat fucking broke and can't even afford bullets, so we're begging for your pennies bond drive, but it didn't have quite the ring. They could have called it that, though, because the last 4 bond drives came up so short we just printed money instead.
So first, it might be helpful if we explained what a war bond is. As a common everyday citizen, you could invest in the war effort that would help pay off this huge industrial undertaking that the war was, and then when the war eventually comes to an end, you get that money returned with interest. So that's what it was. But when John Slattery's character says that the last 3 drives didn't make as much money as the current goal combined, that simply isn't true. There was not a single bond drive during the entirety of the war that fell significantly short of its financial goals.
Here they are. You're the guys in the photograph, right? I heard you were on the train. Let me shake your hands. John Tannock.
John Bradley.
Here's my card. Oh. Listen to me, Rennie. When you get finished being famous, you come see me. Because if you can sell bonds, you can sell homes.
Nearly every veteran I've known or worked with hates this sort of blind adulation. In his book entitled Wartime, veteran Paul Fussell uses moments like this to paint a picture of the disparity that existed between military and civilian cultures, and I suspect that that gap has only grown wider in the decades since World War II. But additionally, I think the film, in moments like this, asks us to what extent are these men being manipulated in the name of raising money for their country. And I suspect the whole process of the war bond trip only added to their senses of survivor's guilt.
It's good of you people to come out tonight in support of the war effort. We really need you to buy bonds, that's for sure. The pole we attached it to was heavy, so it took a number of us. The real heroes are dead on that island. We'd appreciate it if you bought bonds in honor of them. Thank you.
The veterans portrayed here are really stuck between 2 worlds when you think about it. I mean, on one hand, their buddies are still in the Pacific fighting, and yet here they are living the good life on the bond tour. But I'll also add that these are some great recreations that we see here. There was the plaster statue of the flag raising that actually was in Times Square. And then there's all these sort of sideline things like the Victory Polka, the song that is playing in the background that was indeed a popular tune of 1945. So there's just so much really good homework that went into this movie, and it very much shows here.
This war has gone on too long. We have given too many lives. Then those sacrifices would be wasted. And those lives lost in vain.
It's always the little things that trigger the memories, these subtle sights and smells that suddenly throw people back into the maelstrom that are buried deep in their minds. This is such a great bit of artistry on Clint Eastwood's part.
Ira, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Strank, Mike's mom.
Whew, emotional scene. This meeting depicted here, though, it's accurate to the first-hand accounts of what people remembered of this interaction, and it's reflective of the sorts of promises that service members made to each other, I think. Conversely, on the flip side of that coin, family members desperately sought closure. They always wanted to find out, how did my young boy die? Where was he buried? Who was with him when he died? These were very important details for loved ones. And very few men actually had the chance to meet the families of their fallen buddies, as we see depicted here.
Hey, Mike. Can you do me a favor? You put this up, will you?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Ready? Ready? Go.
You get it?
Joe Rosenthal and Bill Janoust are the duo seen here who captured the moment both in black and white photography and in color film footage. But it actually wasn't until 2019 that it was officially determined that Bradley and Gagnon weren't in the photo. Now, they were just yards away, and I suppose that the fact of them not being in the photo certainly doesn't diminish their exploits in the historical record. But as we think about the historical record, it is Marines Harold Schultz and Harold Keller who replaced them in the photos consequently. And it's important for us to keep in mind that when this movie was made in 2005, the filmmakers were going by the official narrative that said that Bradley and Gagnon were in the photo. But suffice it to say, I think if this movie were made today, you'd need to introduce some additional characters into the cast. But speaking from a family standpoint, though, my grandfather wrote to my grandmother, who's pictured here on the desk behind me, as it just so happens. He said that he saw the first flag go up just a few minutes after it was raised. He made no mention of the second flag, and I think that was fairly universal for people who were on Iwo Jima or just offshore from it. But another thing worth mentioning here is that the character of Keys Beach, who is depicted in these latter portions of the film as somewhat of a leatherneck paper pusher and personality handler, he was actually on Suribachi, and he was one of the first correspondents to reach the top. And so he shouldn't be seen as some mere bureaucrat. He was in the thick of it along with the rest of these guys. And one other final point here on this scene, on a very personal note too, mind you, when I finally crested the top of Mount Suribachi during my visit to Iwo in 2023, I got to say that standing on that spot where the two flags were raised was something akin to a spiritual experience. Words really can't convey to you how special a moment that was for me. And if you want to experience a portion of that, I once again welcome you to check out our virtual tour via the link below.
Look what they did to the poor son of a bitch.
"18-year-old Ralph Iggy Ignatowski suffered as cruel a fate as can be imagined. Eyewitnesses, Doc Bradley among them, who found his remains, said that his arms were broken, his eyes were gouged out, his teeth were smashed in, his stomach was bayoneted, his genitals were cut off and shoved in his mouth. For anyone who saw the aftermath of what this poor kid went through, they tried to erase it from their memories, but they never fully could. Something like that just stays with you. And the harsh reality is that in turn, Americans reciprocated the violence. The retribution was not one-sided in the Pacific. Marines and GIs could be just as cruel, and case in point, they would sometimes send Japanese skulls and body parts home to their parents and their girlfriends. To paraphrase the famous Marine Eugene Sledge, war made savages of us all.
Jesus Christ, he's drunk.
Goddamn Indians.
It's a harsh stereotype, but it was one that was widely held amongst Americans of all spectrums. And to speak to this a little bit further, I heartily recommend this book, a biography on Ira Hayes by a scholar named Tom Holm. And I think that the author says something very revealing about these sorts of circumstances. For all their sacrifice and hard work, Native Americans generally were still subjected to a systemic brand of racism. Banks would not loan the former GIs money for housing. Reservations, in that regard, were subject to redlining. Numerous Native Americans were subjected to whites-only rolls in several states, as is the case of Isabel Crocker in Los Angeles. In some states, Natives were not allowed to vote because they were wards of the federal government. And so it really shows you the sort of cultural and limitations that people like Ira Hayes were living in.
We're engaged.
Got a minute? Yep. I'll see you at the car. You heard I'm getting married.
Fun bit of movie trivia here. These steps in Chicago's Union Station were the setting for the famous slow-motion shootout in the beloved gangster flick The Untouchables. So hats off to this film for seeking out the places where these veterans actually traveled on their war bond drive. I think it's a great touch.
We heard this great roar, and we looked up. That was the first of thousands of landings on Iwo.
Look at that.
Yeah.
It's a great scene of an imperiled B-29 conducting an emergency landing on the island. And this is the issue that really gets to the heart of a big question. Were the losses on Iwo Jima worthwhile in the long run? Now, one could say that a lot of the imperiled bombers that conducted emergency landings on the island, maybe that saved as many as 20,000 lives. But could those planes have made it to the Marianas for emergency landings as well? And I think increasingly in historical conversations, the same sort of issue regarding the Battle of Peleliu is being asked of Iwo Jima. Could it have been bypassed? Could it have been diverted? Could lives have been saved? Now, this is in some regard just Monday morning quarterbacking. The island was there, the Marines took it, they made use of it to an extent, but was it worth the cost in the long run? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments section below.
After the bond tour, my dad finally got his operation. Ira tried to get on with his life and put it all behind him. Rennie tried to take advantage of those offers he'd received on the bond tour.
Yes, G-A-G-N-O-N.
I find it a very interesting creative choice on the filmmaker's part to include author James Bradley as a character throughout the film and as a narrator of sorts, though I don't think the son started writing the book until after his father passed away in 1994, so possibly a little bit of embellishment here.
The paper said he died of exposure. There was no autopsy.
The movie really only scratches the surface of Ira Hayes' life. It doesn't mention his prior paratrooper exploits, his service on Bougainville, his return to training with the 5th Marines after the war bond drive. He also served in post-war occupation duties in Japan. A lot of people don't realize that. And then just a few years later, in 1949, he played himself alongside Gagnon and Bradley in the 1949 John Wayne war epic entitled Sands of Iwo Jima. I think that would have been really cool to recreate in the final chapters of this movie. But sadly, when Hayes died of apparent exposure in 1955, some of his family actually insisted that he was murdered after an altercation, but we may never know the full circumstances of his death because there was no autopsy that was ever conducted. But it's safe to presume that there's still an air of mystery about this man, and I think that's why He was considered to be an attractive character for a Hollywood biopic starring Tony Curtis, which was entitled The Outsider. And then just a few years later, he also becomes the topic of a very popular Johnny Cash song. So the story of Ira Hayes still beckons yet.
I wanted to tell you, I'm sorry I wasn't a better father.
One Marine historian once told me that there is actually some friction in the Bradley family, and the end might not have been as heartfelt or as tidy as shown here. I can't confirm that, but I do trust the historian who told me so. It's a fantastic and I think humanistic scene to end on, and it reminds me of the story of sailor Maurice Bell, who was aboard the ill-fated USS Indianapolis at the time of Iwo Jima, and on more than one occasion he said that he spotted a Marine with a flamethrower pack who would go down to the shoreline, strip himself down, place his clothes on top of the gas canisters, and go for a swim. And apparently he did this on several occasions. So it's no stretch of reality at all to show guys swimming during the battle, because at least a handful of them actually were doing so. That's such a good ending. But the question remains, how does Flags of Our Fathers rank on the accuracy charts? And as I was doing a little bit of research for this movie, I came across an article that was written by Major General Fred Haynes, who was a veteran of the battle. And he gave this movie 4 out of 4 stars, and he said that it was something of a time warp because he felt that he was having a conversation with his old wartime buddies again. So those are some pretty high regards there that are expressed on his part. But overall, I think that this movie is a really good example of how historical memory forms. Why do we remember things the way that we do? It's a film that's not merely about heroics, but it also forces us to think about how heroes are used for broader purposes in both myth-making and propaganda, for lack of a better phrase. And I think ultimately the movie's plot is a puzzle, and the characters are all trying to put the pieces of it together. And such is often the case of people who try to make sense of war. And that's why I think Flags of Our Fathers is such a strong film. That wraps up this episode of Real History. Before you leave, make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts on this film and others of the genre. Also be sure to check out our t-shirt store as well as our educational website with all sorts of great resources available to you. We once again really appreciate you tuning in to this special breakdown of Flags of Our Fathers. We'll see you next time on Real History, and until then, as always, my friends, stay curious.